Okay, well, first of all, I just wanted to thank everybody so much for inviting me and for your amazing hospitality, and particularly Victoria for helping. As you may know, I'm just almost on arrival. I came down with a flu that I think I picked up in the airport, so this is kind of my first time out of bed. So I also thank Sven Ola for switching places with me from yesterday, and apologize to all of the speakers that I haven't had the opportunity to hear your talks. My talk is actually quite long and elaborate, and so I think I'm probably only going to give the first part of it, but it will give you a start, and then perhaps we can take up the rest in the discussion. Your handout sort of explains the structure of the talk as a whole, which in a way is very simple. I'm going really through four passages in Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, four passages in which Hegel is either visibly or invisibly, that is to say silently, quoted. This may seem like a sort of trivial and pedantic exercise in reading, but bear with me because my gamble is that the truth can sometimes hide in the details. But that's what I'm going to be talking about, and I have the feeling that right now I'm just going to be able to get through the first one, and we can take up the others more informally in the discussion. Okay, so my title is Hegel Remarks Somewhere, which you may recognize as the opening three words of the 18th Brumaire. I'm going to take it as axiomatic that the transition from early to late Marx, that is from the Marx of the 1844 manuscript, say, to the Marx of Capital, does not represent a radical rupture in Marx's thinking. It does not mark a radical break with Hegel, a conversion from some kind of humanist essentialism to some version of structuralism, for example. And there are other ways of describing Marx's so-called epistemological break or breakthrough, but for many years that was a dominant narrative. Marx never stopped reading Hegel, but his focus does seem to shift from one Hegel to another, from the phenomenology to the logic, let's say, as his primary objects of investigation. If this is the case, which I think it is, then on chronological grounds alone, the 1848 related writings, everything from class struggles in France through to the 18th Brumaire, occupy a transitional time between early and late Marx, and for this reason alone should be an interesting place to revisit the question of the Marx-Hegel couple. But it's a particularly important place to look because it was, after all, the question of the revolution and the lack thereof that had been at the heart of the young Marx's encounter with Hegel. Hegel, or what he stood for, had epitomized for Marx, as for the generation he then belonged to, the young Hegelians, Hegel, or what he stood for, seemed to epitomize at once the problem with German philosophy and its ultimate redemption. That is to say, he both was the symptom of all the problems in Germany, the absence of a French Revolution in Germany, but also seemed to provide the essential conceptual tool for its solution, the solution of these problems. So it stands to reason that the disaster, which was 1848, will complicate this encounter in crucial ways. In the 18th Brumaire, Marx names Hegel once without quoting him, and quotes him 3 times without naming him. When you put all these passages together, and I've kind of just for fun laid them out all together here. When you put these passages all together, the collection presents a surprising array of attitudes, which can be described as following, not necessarily in the correct order. 1, ignoring Hegel. 2, outsmarting Hegel. 3, inverting Hegel, as we've come to expect. 4, out-Hegelianizing Hegel. That is to say, doing an even fancier dialectical maneuver than that which one normally attributes to Hegel. And 5, going down the rabbit hole with Hegel to somewhere quite unexpected for both thinkers. And number 5 is probably a promissory note, so I will leave you. I would probably leave you to ponder that possibility. But I'm not cheating. I do have some thoughts on this. I don't think I'm going to get there though. So the first citation. I think instead of me reading it out loud, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to read the passages yourself. That's number 1 on your handout. The famous opening of the 18th Brumaire, beginning Hegel remarks somewhere that all the great events and characters in world history appear twice, so to speak. Followed by the passage or a passage from Hegel's philosophy of history, which people usually say is the source of this citation. So if you can just take a couple minutes, I'll go on from here. Passage number 1. Okay, you get the idea? You may have recognized that opening snippet, Hegel remarks somewhere, which was the title of my talk. It's the opening 3 words of the 18th Brumaire, and what intrigues me is the studied vagueness of that somewhere. But in any case, Mark mentions Hegel only to remind us what Hegel himself forgot, namely that repetition is never simply repetition. First time as tragedy, second time as farce. The farce, of course, refers to the failed revolution of 1848. Marx is thinking generally about what we might call the whole first European spring, but he's thinking specifically about the workers' revolution in France and its brutal aftermath. The illegitimate coup d'etat, the overwhelming and surprising plebiscite that ratified that, the dissolution of parliamentary democracy, the corruption, the pomp and pageantry, the police, the army, that strange cocktail of populism and authoritarianism, buffoonery and brutality, theatricality and violence that would become the signature of the Second Empire. And by farce, he's referring to the systematic anachronism that had characterized the regime, Napoleon III's regime, or reign, we might call it. The collapse of revolution into an empty repetition or simulacrum of itself, and the evisceration of the class struggle. A repeat performance of 1789, a quotation, imitation, second edition, copy. Counter-revolution was masquerading in the insignia of the revolution, reaction parading as republic. The farce would reach its hyperbole when Louis Bonaparte would assume his uncle's name and nominate himself Emperor Napoleon III 1 year after the coup d'etat. It's Marx's quip that we become famous, so it's easy to forget that the idea had already become a cliché almost as soon as Marx had thought of it. A parody provoking further parodies, inspiring numerous novels from Victor Hugo to Zola, and fueling the burgeoning caricature industry for years to come. Just think of Daumier, for example, who did countless caricatures of this Napoleon, accompanied by a goose instead of an eagle, and so on. In the preface to the second edition of the 18th Brumaire, Marx actually goes to some effort to establish the originality of his own text vis-a-vis the leading competitors, Proudhon and Hugo specifically, which shows that it was an issue, at least for Marx. Originality, that is to say. How do I do this? Invoking Hegel allows Marx to claim his philosophical pedigree while asserting his own originality vis-a-vis his contemporaries, as well as his famous precursor. But the citation also prepares for the patchwork of unattributed and unmarked quotations from Hegel, pasted into the pages to follow. Marx says somewhere, as if he can't be bothered to look it up. And people after Marx have generally located that somewhere in Hegel's lectures in the philosophy of history, which would have been available to Marx. They were published by then. Hegel's remark is easier to decipher than it might seem at first. I mean, it seems very simple. Hegel says, in all periods of the world, a political revolution is sanctioned in men's opinions when it repeats itself. Thus, Napoleon was twice defeated, and the Bourbons twice expelled. By repetition, that which at first appeared merely a matter of chance and contingency becomes a real and ratified existence. So he's not talking about parody or comedy, he's talking about ratification and the authentication of what happened. But it's harder to decipher than it might seem at first, if only because Hegel's own examples all seem to point in such wildly divergent directions. But he's saying more than the banality that history repeats itself. And for the record, Hegel hadn't forgotten about farce. In the same philosophy of history lectures, he will specifically describe the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty as precisely that, a 15-year farce, he calls it. But it's the broader issue of theatricality that preoccupies him. Repetition, says Hegel, ratifies the event. It illustrates the truth of historical necessity behind the surface appearance of contingency. The context of this little sidetrack into repetition is he's actually talking about Caesar and the assassination of Caesar, who was destroying the Republic by his dictatorial practice and the attempt to the assassination of him, which did not, Hegel said, put an end to the erosion of the Republic. The Republic was essentially dead, so Caesar, although killed, couldn't really be killed. Julius Caesar, the man, did not come along by chance. It wasn't the contingency of birth or the idiosyncrasies of personality that made him grab power. His appearance is a symptom of the fact that the Republic was already defunct. The proof of the matter being that no sooner had Julius Caesar been assassinated than he was recreated. Another Caesar came along. The Republic was once again, and this time definitively, toppled. If it seems that Hegel is mouthing kind of textbook Hegelian platitudes, as they're called, about the iron grip of necessity, we should remember that this is, after all, a textbook. Koji and Karatani and Slavoj Žižek have suggested a more interesting reading. Caesar repeats. He returns with a vengeance in the figure of his nephew, another nephew, Augustus, but only as his name. The murder inaugurates a substitution of the symbolic order, the name of the father, for the real body of the father, of the tyrant. When Gaius Octavius renames himself Augustus Caesar, Caesar's personal name turns into a generic title, a role, an institution. Caesar the dictator becomes a Caesar. A style of politics, Caesarism, a kind of function. Augustus Caesar is the Caesar Augustus. He is the passing into, of course, functions like Tsar, Kaiser, and eventually into salad dressing for some reason. Repetition for Hegel does not specifically signal farce or buffoonery, but it does point to a crucial theatricality that Hegel will never stop exploring, an uncoupling of word from thing, a kind of hypertrophy of the signifier that not only spells a crisis of representation, but may also open up the possibility of re-signification, or such is the gamble. So the basic point here is that in repetition, the representational regime as such gets emptied out. So the example of Caesar, the man, the name of the man becoming Caesar, the title, is a key sign of, is a key example of that crisis. Something which will throw into crisis, as it happens, Marx's whole representational schema, upon which his whole philosophy of history rests. 1848 had marked a blow for France, for revolutionary politics, and for Marxist theory. And in the 18th Brumaire, Marx is registering the multiple crises inflicted, not only on the workers of France, but on his own theory of revolution, on the freshly minted science of historical materialism, as it had been baptized, and on all the principles that had flowed from this. First, a break with the expectation that the partial revolution of 1789 would be followed necessarily and inevitably by a second revolution in which political equality would be completed by social equality, rather than functioning as an alibi for its absence. So rather than a revolution that protected bourgeois rights by translating these into political rights, presented in the guise of the universal, but only so as to reinforce the non-universality or the partiality of economic and social rights, which is Marx's analysis of the first revolution. The second revolution, which is to complete the first revolution, which is already brewing in the first revolution, is what Marx had called a revolution within the revolution, is going to, by the same forces that had brought about the first revolution, activate a social emancipation, economic equality, which will no longer need the alibi or pretext of mere political representation. That's basically the Marxist theory of the French Revolution needing to complete itself and repeat itself. Second, so first a break with that expectation that the first revolution would be completed in the second, rather than simply parodied. Second, a break with the laws of history, that what Marx and Engels especially will call the laws of history, outlined as recently as the German ideology. That is, the view of history as propelled by the motor of class antagonism. Third, and consequently, a questioning of the supposed binary of the social and the political. Napoleon's regime presents the enigma of a state that is not behaving the way states are supposed to behave. It is no longer tethered to civil society as its representative superstructural formation. It is not representative of any class interest. It has relinquished even the appearance of parliamentary legitimacy. It is, in fact, sheer executive power running on empty, sustained by coercion and by the display of coercion, if these can be distinguished. if the state can no longer be seen here as the tool of the ruling class, or what they sometimes call the committee managing class interests, this is because the class struggle itself has lost its coherence, and that is because the idea of class has lost its meaning. All these crises were confirmed and compounded by the appearance of this strange class that seems to be no class, a non-class or not class, a negative class, not in the way that the proletarian had said to be the determinate negation of class in Marx's early writings, i.e., the class that having nothing can stand for everything, that has nothing to lose but its chains, and therefore everything to gain, but whose gains will be universal gains, as in the Communist Manifesto. What's the difference? This strange class non-class that emerges in the 18th Brumaire displays a peculiar form of negativity, what we might call an infinite negative judgment. Because it has no defining edges, has no polarity, it cannot enter into class antagonism and therefore cannot be a class at all. I'm, of course, referring to the motley crew that functioned as Napoleon's henchmen and brought him and sustained him in power. There's a lot more to be said about this, but I think I'll just pass over this for time. Karatani describes the crisis of representation unleashed by the regime of Louis Bonaparte. The surplus of representation over represented, of signifier over signified, if you like, evidenced in the enigma of a political order that is not expressive of class struggle, not even serving to embellish, mollify, or disguise this struggle, simply indifferent to class struggle, because the binary on which the very concept of class rests seem to have reached a stalemate, an empty collision without directionality or vector, which is basically the nullification of the class struggle and therefore of class, because class is defined antagonistically, it needs edges. Thus the paradox of parliamentary representation under Louis Bonaparte, which perhaps expresses the paradox of parliamentary representation in general. Social classes choose representatives that can't represent them, while representatives are not representing or expressing class interest. This is the paradox of a sheer representation that does not represent anything or anybody, but itself, its representationality, presenting itself as such, the fiction or staging of sovereign power. So in Spinoza's terms, the perfect subordination of potentia to potestas, the display of power as its own manifestation rather than being an empowering of anything in particular. This is what Marx means by his obsessive phrase, the situation of phrase outstripping content, this excess of signification, untethered from every referent. So whereas under Louis Philippe, the parliamentary state had been the instrument of the ruling class, under the Napoleon III, the state, and I'm reading here Marx, seems to have made itself independent. The political regime appears to be an empty bubble, suspended, as he says, in midair, which is actually impossible if you're, if anything that Marx had said up to now can be sustained, because it seems to suggest the uncoupling of civil society from the state, of the uncoupling of the social from the political, and the specter of politics, but with politics, the whole structural stratum, ideology, law, everything kind of floating freely, untethered from every base. So you have this kind of this specter of pure superstructure without any structure on which it's sustained, which strictly speaking makes Marxism, makes historical materialism impossible. So that's the first quote. So Marx corrects Hegel by reminding him of what Hegel had forgotten. That is to say, the repetition is not simply repetition, but is the transformation of tragedy into, but is farcical repetition. Hegel, possibly by my reading, might explicate what Marx means. That's by his account of the repetition of Caesar as Caesarism. He actually gives a theoretical account of a philosophical account of what Marx means too quickly by parody, which will actually cast huge light on the crisis that the 18th Brumaire is registering, which is actually all about this hypertrophy of signification or representation. Okay, so that's just like the first step. Marx nods to Hegel, he corrects Hegel, and Hegel sort of comes back, not to refute Marx, but to actually give Marx a kind of theoretical scaffolding for what is in the 18th era completely baffling. Okay, so that's number one. What is my time like?
10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes more.
Okay, so I'm going to just, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to point to the remaining passages which you have before you, because it will take a long time to kind of work through these. The second citation, and they're all quite, the next two are quite obvious citations of Hegel. So number two, we have the passage from the 18th Brumaire, which goes like this. He's again describing this kind of parodic, empty citationality or repetition. Nephews are repeating uncles. A second revolution is masquerading as a first. And history, and this represents the standstill of history. This is Marx's point. It's not really funny. I mean, it represents the actual evisceration of the stalling of the motor of history, because history is just kind of stuttering in this empty repetition of simulacra. So this is why Marx writes, if any episode in history has been colored gray on gray, three words which even by then I don't think one could read without reference to Hegel's. This is the one. Men and events appear as schlemiels in reverse, or as shadows that have lost their bodies. You know, the Chamiso story about Peter Schlemiel is the guy who made this kind of devil's pact and gave up his shadow, and would be forever haunted by the loss of his shadow. So here Marx, you know, here we have the specter of a shadow without body, which is basically what basically describes the regime of parody as pure excessive signification without any ground, which, you know, can more or less summarize what will become, you know, theoretically the problem of the autonomy of politics. Shadows that have lost their bodies. The revolution has paralyzed its own proponents and has endowed only its enemies with passion and violence. In other words, we have this, you know, this parallel paradox of a kind of counter-revolution without any revolution to counter. The revolution has paralyzed its own proponents and has endowed only its enemies with passion and violence. So this is this kind of shadowy, paralyzed, simulacral condition of the French political scene in 1852. But if you recall what it remembers, the famous, much vilified passage from Hegel's Philosophy of Right, the juxtaposition is actually quite surprising. So I don't really need to remind you, but I will anyway. This is the, you know, infamous, much reviled Owl of Minerva passage, which has seemed to so many readers, and certainly of the young Hegelian generation, to signal philosophy's absolute bankruptcy and accommodation to the status quo. It's renunciation of any kind of political or practical efficacy, the regression from, or the sort of complete renunciation of changing the world and acquiescence in merely interpreting it. Hegel's famous statement goes, this admonition in the preface of the Philosophy of Right, when philosophy paints its gray and gray, a shape of life has grown old and it cannot be rejuvenated, but only recognized by the gray and gray of philosophy. The owl of Minerva begins its flight only at dawn. So, note the inversion. Where Hegel had described gray as the color of philosophy, and this is in turn a citation from Goethe's. Oh, here we are, from Goethe's Faust. We're in a good place to discuss this. Mephistopheles' taunt that all theory is gray. Marx sees it as the color in which the world itself was by now drenched. So for Hegel, this is the color of philosophy. For Marx, this shadow has become the color of the real world. That is to say, in 1848, political reality has taken on the spectral character of philosophy. And I just want to recall here that in the introduction, the 1843 introduction to contribution to Hegel's philosophy of right, it had been not France. This is while there was, what the 1848 was still pending. It had been not France, but Germany that had been identified as the country of parody, of shadows without bodies, of copies without originals, precisely in contrast to revolutionary France. Germany was identified as the place where history had stopped happening centuries before. In fact, throughout the 18th Brumaire, Marx describes the French political scene in much the same terms as he'd been describing the German philosophical scene, only a few years later in the supposed Fallmouth period. So in the Holy Family, he describes criticism. Okay, like the lumpen proletariat as being unproductive. They don't produce anything with their ideas. The young Hegelians, like the finance aristocrats of the 18th Brumaire, are said to speculate. Bruno Bauer, like the peasants, again in the 18th Brumaire, wallows in pigsties. These are all allusions from his diatribes against the young Hegelians, particularly the German ideology and the Holy Family. And Max Stirner himself, who's the key target of the German ideology, is described as being as lumpige, as shabby and crappy generally, as the lumpen he celebrates, and so on. So this is this very curious inversion, and the next two passages are actually the more interesting and the most kind of crazily confusing, where Marx seems to be converting what seems to be a theoreticism on Hegel's part into the very signifier of activism. And so I will, I guess, just leave these with you, only to ask the question whether these are Marx's moments of retrieval in the 18th Brumaire, where this sort of seemingly impossible and incurable stasis that was the Napoleonic regime of representation or parody, this condition of stasis, seems to be, the very conditions of stasis seem to become the occasion for the overcoming of that stasis, where repetition, deepened and exaggerated and prolonged, becomes actually the occasion of radical novelty. And just how, so this is my question of whether Marx is out-Hegelianizing Hegel at this point, producing an even more magical version of the dialectical rescue, from disaster, lie the seeds of its own overcoming. Or whether he's on to something completely different. And the final passage where Hegel cites Marx, citing Hamlet, and it's very clear that Marx is not citing Hamlet, he's citing Hegel, citing Hamlet, but I can get it another time, where both Hegel and Marx seem to be themselves, wandering in very unexpected territory, where they seem to be genuinely quite lost, but where the possibility of a kind of overcoming is still hovering in the background. So I think I'll stop here, leaving you with that. Thank you.